Most backyard gardeners look at their shaded spots and see failure before they even start. They assume nothing productive can happen there. They're wrong. Dead wrong. What I'm about to show you flips conventional gardening wisdom completely upside down. There are vegetables that don't just tolerate shade, they actually prefer it, and some will outperform their sun-grown cousins by a margin you won't believe until you see it yourself. The one at number 4 made me question everything I thought I knew about growing food. For thousands of years, farmers across the globe cultivated entire harvests in forest clearings, against stone structures, in valley shadows, places where direct sunlight was scarce or non-existent. They weren't fighting limitations. They were working with conditions that certain plants were specifically adapted for. Modern gardening advice has conditioned us to believe that vegetables need maximum sun exposure to thrive. But that advice was written for industrial-scale farming, not for the shaded fence line behind your garage or the north side of your house that never sees direct light. What you're about to learn will completely transform those forgotten spaces. Before we dive into the specific vegetables, let me tell you what to expect. One of these has been commercially cultivated in complete darkness for nearly 2 centuries, and is considered a delicacy in Europe's finest restaurants. Another one will actually produce sweeter, more tender growth when you deliberately reduce its light exposure. And the vegetable we're saving for the end, it's probably already invading your property right now, and you've been ripping it out without realizing you're destroying one of the most nutritious shade crops on the planet. This isn't theory. This is practical, tested knowledge that works. Let's begin. Number 12. Lettuce. Walk into any farmer's market in summer and you'll notice something interesting. The best lettuce vendors set up in the shade. Always. That's not coincidence. That's centuries of accumulated wisdom playing out in real time. Lettuce cultivation dates back at least 4,500 years to ancient Egypt, where it was depicted in tomb paintings showing garden plots deliberately sheltered by surrounding architecture and shade-producing trees. Those ancient farmers understood what modern seed packets often fail to mention. Lettuce actively suffers in direct sunlight, especially during warm weather. Here's what happens in shade that makes all the difference. When lettuce grows without harsh sun beating down on it, the leaves expand wider and slower. The growth is more measured, more controlled, and the harvest window stretches from a few rushed weeks to a full month or longer. The flavor profile stays consistently mild and sweet instead of turning bitter and sharp. The texture remains crisp rather than becoming tough and fibrous. The science backs this up completely. Lettuce cells contain extremely high water content. When exposed to direct sun, the plant experiences rapid transpiration, essentially sweating itself into a stressed state that triggers premature bolting. Shade eliminates that stress almost entirely. Find your shadiest garden bed, the one you've been ignoring because you assumed nothing would grow there. Plant lettuce there, water it regularly but gently, then step back and watch it do what it was designed to do, thrive in conditions most gardeners avoid. Number 11. Spinach. This one catches people off guard every single time. Spinach has a reputation as a robust, full-sun vegetable. That reputation is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how this plant actually functions. Spinach originated in ancient Persia around 600 AD, cultivated in shaded courtyards, specifically because the intense desert sun would have destroyed it within days. It spread along trade routes not because it was easy to grow in bright light, but because it survived and produced in conditions where more delicate crops failed completely. The key to understanding spinach is understanding bolting. In direct afternoon sun, especially as temperatures climb, spinach bolts aggressively. It shoots up flowering stalks. The leaves turn unbearably bitter, and your entire crop becomes worthless almost overnight. Shade fundamentally changes this dynamic. It slows the bolting process dramatically, keeping leaves tender, mild, and harvestable for weeks longer than any sunny location would allow. From a botanical standpoint, spinach is exceptionally efficient at photosynthesis under low light conditions. Its broad, flat leaf structure is specifically evolved to capture diffuse, filtered light, the kind that bounces off walls or filters through tree branches. This means you can tuck spinach along fence lines, beneath taller companion plants, or against north-facing walls, and still harvest dark, nutrient-dense leaves week after week. There's something almost poetic about that. A plant that succeeds not by chasing the brightest light available, but by maximizing whatever it receives. Number 10. Arugula. If you've ever planted arugula in a sunny spot and watched it turn from perfect salad green to inedible weed in what felt like 48 hours, you already know this plant has strong opinions about sunlight. Arugula has been valued since Roman times, documented in 1st century texts as both a food source and medicinal herb. Roman soldiers reportedly consumed it for sustained energy during long campaigns. It grew naturally along the shaded margins of Mediterranean gardens, in the cool shadows cast by stone walls and established olive trees. In full sun, particularly during summer heat, arugula's life cycle accelerates to an almost comical degree. The leaves develop an aggressive, unpleasant bitterness. The plant bolts so fast you can practically watch it happen. Your harvest window collapses to nearly nothing. In shade, everything slows down in the best possible way. The leaves remain mild enough for fresh salads while retaining that characteristic peppery complexity. The plant stays productive, allowing repeated harvests across an entire growing season instead of one rushed week. Botanically, arugula belongs to the Brassica family, a plant group that evolved in cool, partially shaded woodland environments. When grown in reduced light, arugula produces more of the specific glucosinolates responsible for its signature flavor, meaning shade-grown arugula often tastes better, not worse, than its sun-grown equivalent. Scatter a handful of arugula seeds in your shadiest bed. You'll harvest continuously for months. Sometimes the most flavorful things develop best away from intense exposure. Number 9. Kale. The modern kale craze has created some strange assumptions about how this vegetable should be grown. Most people plant it in full sun because that's what the gardening websites recommend. But kale's actual history tells a completely different story. Throughout medieval Europe, kale was a survival crop grown in cottage gardens along the shaded north sides of homes and outbuildings, in locations where other vegetables simply refused to produce. It fed families through brutal winters not because it required ideal conditions, but because it thrived despite difficult ones. In shade, kale exhibits behavior that surprises even experienced growers. It grows more slowly, yes, but the leaves that develop are noticeably thicker, darker, and more concentrated in nutrients than sun-grown kale. The plant responds to reduced light by consolidating its resources rather than spreading them thin. From a cellular perspective, kale is packed with chlorophyll-producing cells that function remarkably efficiently under low-light conditions. It tolerates partial shade better than almost any other brassica, maintaining vigorous growth with as little as 3 hours of indirect light daily. Plant kale in your darkest bed, harvest the outer leaves regularly, leaving the center intact. It will continue producing steadily without complaint, deep into autumn and often well beyond. Kale doesn't demand ideal conditions, it just needs an opportunity. Number 8. Swiss chard. This is one of the most visually stunning vegetables you can grow, and one that performs remarkably well in conditions most gardeners write off as unusable. Swiss chard originated along the Mediterranean coast, growing wild on rocky, partially shaded cliffsides long before humans began deliberately cultivating it. Ancient Greeks and Romans documented its use both as food and medicine in texts that scholars still reference today. What makes Swiss chard particularly fascinating in shade is what happens to its color. The vibrant reds, yellows, and oranges in the stems don't fade in low light. They intensify. The plant produces higher concentrations of anthocyanins and carotenoids as a response to reduced sunlight. The result is a vegetable that becomes both more beautiful and more nutritionally dense when grown in shade. Practically speaking, Swiss chard tolerates partial shade exceptionally well, requiring only 2 to 4 hours of indirect light per day to thrive. It also handles heat better than most leafy greens, making it a reliable producer across multiple seasons when other crops struggle. Plant it where light is gentle and filtered. Harvest outer leaves regularly. Let the center continue growing. It will reward you generously. There's something quietly remarkable about a plant that responds to less light by becoming more vibrant. Number 7. Cilantro. This is the herb that has defeated more gardeners than perhaps any other, and almost always for the exact same reason. They planted it in full sun. Cilantro bolts in heat and direct sunlight faster than almost any culinary herb in existence. One week it looks lush and productive. The next week it's shooting up flower stalks and the harvestable leaves are gone. Most people blame their skills or their seeds. The actual problem is light exposure. Cilantro originates from the cooler, partially shaded regions of southern Europe and Western Asia. It has been cultivated for over 3,000 years, appearing in ancient Sanskrit texts and Bronze Age archaeological sites. In shade, cilantro's entire life cycle slows dramatically. The leaves stay broad, flat, and ready to harvest for weeks longer than sun-grown plants. The flavor remains bright and complex instead of degrading into that soapy, unpleasant bitterness that over-mature cilantro develops. Plant cilantro in your shadiest available bed. Succession plant new rows every 2 to 3 weeks. You'll maintain a continuous harvest throughout the entire growing season. Number 6. Bok choy. We're halfway through this list now, and from here forward, these vegetables become increasingly unexpected. Bok choy is fundamental to Asian cuisine, with cultivation history reaching back over 1,500 years in China. It was grown in the shaded, cool valleys of southern China long before it spread globally, cultivated beneath the canopy of taller crops in traditional polyculture systems that used shade strategically as a growing advantage. In direct sunlight, bok choy bolts quickly, and the stems become tough and fibrous, almost woody in texture. In shade, the stalks remain crisp, the leaves stay tender, and the plant produces continuously instead of rushing through its life cycle to seed. Scientifically, bok choy is a cool season brassica that reaches peak quality at temperatures between 55 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Shade maintains soil temperatures within that optimal range even as summer progresses, effectively extending your productive season by weeks. Plant it in partial shade, keep soil consistently moist, harvest when heads reach palm size. It will produce far more than you expect. Sometimes the most nourishing crops thrive in quiet, cool, overlooked spaces. Number 5. Mosh. This is the vegetable that genuinely shocked me when I first tested it, and it continues to outperform expectations season after season. Mosh, also called corn salad or lamb's lettuce, is one of the least recognized and most productive shade crops in existence. It has been eaten across Europe for centuries, growing wild in the shaded edges of grain fields and harvested by hand during winter months when virtually nothing else was available. In the 1600s, it was deliberately cultivated in French monastery kitchen gardens as a winter staple, valued precisely because it grew and produced in conditions that defeated every other crop they attempted. In my own garden beds, mosh outproduced every other leafy green in full shade, delivering consistent harvests through late autumn and into early winter with zero supplemental light, zero protection, and minimal watering. Botanically, mosh is extraordinarily cold-hardy and shade-adapted. Its low rosette growth form keeps it close to the ground where temperatures remain more stable and available light, while limited, is most consistently accessible. The flavor is mild, slightly nutty, and genuinely delicious, completely unlike anything most gardeners have tasted fresh from their own plots. Number 4. Mushrooms. Technically fungi rather than vegetables, but grown in home gardens worldwide as food crops and absolutely essential to include on any legitimate shade-growing list. Mushrooms have been deliberately cultivated by humans for at least 2,000 years. Chinese records from around 600 AD describe the intentional cultivation of shiitake mushrooms on shaded, inoculated logs, a methodology still successfully employed today. Here's the critical point most people miss. Mushrooms do not photosynthesize. They require zero light to grow. In fact, direct sunlight actively damages them, drying out the mycelium and halting growth almost immediately. Your shadiest garden corner, the space beneath your deck, against a north-facing wall, under tree canopy, those are ideal mushroom habitats. Oyster mushrooms, shiitakes, and wine caps all produce abundantly in these conditions with minimal intervention required. The practical setup is remarkably straightforward. Inoculated logs, straw beds, or ready-to-fruit growing kits positioned in your darkest, most consistently moist garden space. Mushrooms teach us something important. Not everything that feeds us requires sunlight to accomplish it. Number 3. Belgian endive. What most gardeners don't realize about this next crop will fundamentally change how they think about light requirements for vegetables. Belgian endive, also known as forced chicory, has a history that reads almost like fiction. In the 1830s, a Belgian farmer named Jan Lammers accidentally left chicory roots in his dark cellar over winter. When he returned months later, those roots had sprouted pale, compact, extraordinarily tender heads of leaves in complete darkness, something that had never been intentionally produced before. He tasted them. They were unlike anything he had encountered. Within decades, forced chicory had become one of the most prized vegetables in European cuisine, served in elite restaurants across Paris and Brussels, celebrated by accomplished chefs throughout the continent. It was created entirely by accident, in total darkness, in a forgotten corner of a cellar. Today, Belgian endive is grown commercially in dark, climate-controlled facilities, never seeing a single ray of sunlight from germination through harvest. You can replicate this process at home with nothing more than a container, soil, and a dark cupboard. The most celebrated shade vegetable on this list never needed light at all. Number 2, watercress. This vegetable has a history most people never learn, and a shade tolerance that genuinely astonishes gardeners who discover it firsthand. Watercress has been consumed by humans for over 2,000 years. It was a staple food of Roman soldiers who gathered it from shaded stream banks during military campaigns throughout Europe. Francis Bacon documented its medicinal properties in the 17th century. It sustained working-class communities in England during the Industrial Revolution, harvested from shaded, cool waterways running through the countryside. It grows naturally in moving water beneath tree canopy, in environments with almost zero direct sunlight whatsoever. In a home garden setting, watercress can be grown in containers kept consistently moist or in shallow water-filled trays positioned in deep shade. It requires virtually no maintenance beyond initial setup and occasional watering, yet it produces continuously throughout the season. Nutritionally, watercress ranks among the most nutrient-dense leafy greens on Earth, extraordinarily rich in vitamins K, C, and A, along with powerful antioxidants that continue to be studied by researchers. It thrived in shadows for thousands of years, feeding populations with limited resources. That quiet abundance deserves attention. Number 1, ground elder. And here, saved for last, is the one that will permanently transform how you view shade gardening. Ground elder is a plant that most gardeners classify as an aggressive weed. It spreads relentlessly through shaded garden beds, beneath trees, along fence lines, in forgotten yard corners worldwide. Most people invest considerable effort trying to eradicate it. But here's what those gardeners don't know. Ground elder, also called bishop's weed, or herb gerard, was one of the most vital food plants of medieval Europe. It was deliberately cultivated by monks in monastery gardens across the entire continent, grown specifically in the deep shade of stone walls and orchard trees where other crops failed. It was eaten as a spring vegetable, used as a pot herb exactly the way modern cooks use spinach, and highly valued as a medicinal herb for treating gout, arthritis, and joint inflammation. It was so prized that it was intentionally introduced to monastery gardens throughout Northern Europe, carried by monks and planted in the shadiest corners they could locate, because those were precisely the conditions where it grew best. Nutritionally, ground elder is rich in vitamins C and A, potassium, and a range of compounds that contemporary research continues investigating for anti-inflammatory properties. The most productive shade plant on this entire list is probably already growing in your garden right now. You may have been pulling it out by the roots. Sometimes the most valuable thing in your space is the one you've been treating as a problem. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to hear from you. Which of these 12 vegetables surprised you most? Which ones are already growing in your yard without you even planting them? Drop your answers in the comments below. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know what's happening in your growing spaces. Here's what I need you to understand. Every single vegetable on this list shares one critical characteristic. They were all already known by ancient farmers, by medieval monastery gardeners, by indigenous growers who successfully fed entire communities from spaces that modern gardening culture dismisses without a second thought. This knowledge didn't vanish because it stopped being accurate, it disappeared because we stopped paying attention to it. We constructed a gardening culture obsessed with ideal conditions, perfect sun exposure, perfect soil composition, perfect plant spacing, and in that obsession with perfection, we abandoned the accumulated wisdom of working productively with whatever conditions we actually have. The shade in your yard is not a problem requiring a solution. It's a distinct growing environment waiting to be properly understood and utilized. The gardeners who grasp this, historically and today, are the ones who harvest abundantly regardless of what their property looks like. There's a deeper principle embedded in everything we've covered. The spaces we overlook, the dark corners, the forgotten edges, the areas we dismiss as useless, are rarely as empty or unproductive as we assume them to be. Ancient cultivators understood this instinctively. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for perfect conditions to materialize. They worked with shadow and stone and challenging soil, and they discovered abundance there because they actively looked for it with open minds. We have inherited those same gardens, the same corners, the same shade. What we lost was the willingness to recognize potential in places that appeared difficult. Every overlooked space in your garden represents an invitation, not a limitation. The most productive gardens are rarely the ones with maximum sunlight. They're the ones tended by the most curious, observant hands. Here's the truth this entire video has been building toward. Your garden does not need to be perfect to feed you adequately. It doesn't need full sun, ideal exposure, or conditions pulled directly from a textbook. It needs your attention, your curiosity, your willingness to look at difficult spaces and genuinely ask yourself, what could thrive here? The 12 plants on this list aren't exceptions to established gardening rules. They're evidence that those rules were always incomplete, written for different contexts and different goals. Shade is not the absence of viable growing conditions. It is a growing condition in itself, one that has quietly sustained humanity for thousands of years across countless cultures and climates. Your darkest corner might actually be your most powerful and productive one. So here's my final question for you. Which plant on this list are you going to try first in your shadiest spot? Tell me in the comments. I read every response, and I genuinely appreciate hearing what you're experimenting with in your space. If this video added practical value to your gardening knowledge, subscribe, because every week we're uncovering more of what the garden has always been trying to teach us if we're willing to listen.